Welcome everyone to BI UK webinar today. This is the first of 3 webinars on using AI to improve behavioural research. First of all, I'd like to introduce the speakers, and then I will say how we're going to conduct the session. I'm Susan Michie. I'm co-director of BI UK and also director of the Centre for Behaviour Change at UCL. We also have with us Janna Hastings, who's Assistant Professor of Medical Knowledge and Decision Making at the Universities of Zurich and St. Gallen, and a computer scientist by background, and Professor Robert West, who's Emeritus Professor of Health Psychology at UCL. During the session, there'll be a Q&A box open, so please do put any questions because we've ensured that we've got plenty of time to discuss your questions. So today we're going to introduce AI and behavioural research with a focus on generative AI. And then over the next few months, we'll have a second session on AI-supported data analysis. And thirdly, responsible use of AI in behavioural research. So today we're aiming to increase knowledge about AI and how it can improve behavioural research, to introduce some AI tools and show firstly how they can assist behavioural research, but also pitfalls to avoid, and demonstrate the use of 2 AI tools. And I should say that it's a very exciting time to be discussing AI. Every week comes up with something new. So 2 weeks ago, we had the UK Prime Minister setting up a blueprint to turbocharge AI to bring about all sorts of change across the country, with £14 billion to be invested by tech firms. Then only last week, we had Trump announcing Stargate with $100 million immediately going up to, $100 billion immediately going up to $500 billion over the next 4 years. And then yesterday, probably most people have seen the sudden emergence of DeepSeek from China, which is already topping the App Store, the Apple App Store download, and promises a real paradigm shift in AI, using much fewer resources, which actually is going to be incredibly important, not only to make AI more equitable, but also, I hope most people know what a huge drain on carbon emissions or production of carbon emissions AI can produce. So really important in terms of environmental cost. Okay, so I'll just say a few words to begin with. Then Janna will have an introduction to AI with a demo, and then we'll go have questions and answers. Then over to Robert for generative AI and intervention design with a demo suggested components of a behavioural intervention, and more discussion, and then just a summary at the end. Okay, so how do generative AI and analytical AI differ? Now, in this audience, there are going to be some people who have got a huge amount of knowledge, and this is just obvious, and other people who have very little knowledge, and so this is new information for them. So apologies to those who find this too basic. So one can think of generative AI versus analytical or more traditional AI. So generative AI are, for example, ChatGPT, Claude. Elicit and Scite will actually use research studies and produce research studies. And then DeepSeek is the one that we just heard about yesterday from China. Then analytical AI, things like IBM Watson. So in essence, generative AI produces new content, whereas analytical AI classifies and reasons with existing information. So they also differ in purposes. Generative AI is designed to create new content or data, often mimicking human-like creativity, whereas analytical AI is task-specific and focuses on analysis, prediction, classification, or rule-based decision-making based on existing data. Also, if we think about output and applications, there are differences. Generative AI generates original context, such as text, images, audio, or code. For example, answering a question, writing a story, designing an image, or chatbots. Whereas Analytical AI provides labels, predictions, or decisions. For example, fraud detection systems, weather forecasting, diagnosing diseases using medical imaging. So both really important, but different foci. So this webinar will focus on the use of generative AI in behavioural research. And as I said before, we'll have a future one on analytical AI to analyse data and make predictions to novel behaviour change scenarios, and then a third one on responsible use of AI. Okay, and now I'm going to hand over to Janna Hastings to introduce generative AI.
So, hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar also from my side. I'll just share my slides and check that that works. Okay, great. So I bringing a more technical perspective and just talk you through quickly what are the main aspects of generative AI that it's good to be aware of. So I'd like to start with a historical perspective and just to bring the idea that AI as a kind of umbrella actually encompasses lots of different technologies, and that these different technologies are all still with us and in use today and sort of come together in some way to create the new capabilities that we see in the recent years. So, for example, as far back as the 90s, we already had implementations, particularly in medicine, of AI based on logic. So we call this good old-fashioned AI. And the key features of logic-based AI are that it's absolutely transparent, and everything that it does or sort of infers or reasons about, you can always have proofs that this is consistent and correct. But unfortunately, it's difficult to formulate all the logical rules that you need for such AI. And the world tends to be a bit more messy than that. So most of the modern performant AIs depend on learning from data in some form. So machine learning becomes more performant as the technology has developed. And our modern machine learning systems, including generative AI, are all based on what's called deep neural networks. And the key thing about deep neural networks is that they are, the word deep here refers to the size or the level of depth of layers of the network, and the networks can be really huge. So this is one of the things about modern systems such as ChatGPT. They are really, really huge. So we're talking billions and billions of parameters, and the parameters are what are trained and then store in this kind of dense networks the information which we afterwards extract in all of these different ways. So deep neural networks can be used in what Susan referred to as analytical purposes. They can be used to give specific classifications for things like labeling images, and they have been used that way by systems such as Google for a long time. But what's new in recent years is this capability of generative, where the model itself produces not just a very specific answer to a question, but output in a particular format, such as text, which is well formed according to the rules of that format. So text that is formatted as a human interaction, a human-like interaction, is characteristic of our modern chatbot interactions. And these depend on, in order to make them performant in the way that they are performant now, they depend on really masses of training data. To give the networks this kind of capability, you need sort of all the information which can be mined off the internet in order to train these models and give them these capabilities to generate in a well-formed way. So the capabilities of these models include, as we just discussed, text input, so it can sort of process this input coming in as text and understand well enough what you are asking for, and then give a response in text. But they're not limited to text. They can also process images or other modalities such as audio or video, and they do this based on the capability to kind of convert all of these different types of information into a backbone of a kind of numeric representation. And this numeric representation is built along the meaning of what's in the things. So you can sort of translate, of course, between different languages, but you can also translate between different modalities where they have meanings in common. And then you can produce with this kind of model outputs which correspond and are well formed in text or in images or in other modalities. And this is really exciting because it's flexible and general purpose and works for a lot of different use cases and purposes which before we couldn't really solve or address with computers. So some of the commonly used generative AI models, as Susan already mentioned, so I don't go in great detail, but ChatGPT by OpenAI, Claude is a model by Anthropic, Llama by Meta, Gemini by Google. These are the mainstream ones. Now we can add DeepSeek to this list as of this week as kind of a suddenly mainstream model, which is also really exciting. And there are many other models which are specialized for different purposes and which are somehow produced by either different companies or by these companies producing different models for research or for application purposes. And when you interact with such a model, it's important to bear in mind that there are some different components of your interaction with the model. So for example, the overarching role which the system plays is somehow defined by a system instruction. And when you interact with a model through a website or an app, this has been defined for you by the website or app, but if you interact with such a system via an API or programmatically or by running the model yourself, for some of the smaller models that's possible, then you need to kind of set up what the system instruction is and tell the model how it is supposed to behave. And usually this kind of instruction, something like, you are a helpful assistant, be nice, interact in a good way with your users. And then you have what's called context, and context includes your information which you provide to the model as a part of your interaction, but also any previous interactions such as earlier messages within the same chat. And it's helpful to know that that's what it's doing, because if you want to ask about a kind of a totally new topic, it may be helpful to switch to a fresh chat. Otherwise, your new questions may inherit some of the responses from your previous interactions within the same context. And then, of course, you have your current input and instruction, and we will look at an example. So I will shift to a demonstration mode in a minute, but just to mention some what's called prompting strategies. So the prompt for such an interaction is your instruction, your current instruction, and it can be quite detailed and long if you want to give examples to the model of what sort of thing you're looking for, but it can also be just a simple question. And of course here it's a simple question: what behavior change techniques are commonly used to support healthy eating? And this particular question was posed to Claude. That's one of the commonly used commercial models. But there are other prompting strategies that you can try. For example, you can give a hint to the model about what kind of length of response you want to get back. So answer in only one paragraph, or give a concise answer, or even give one-word answer, and it should try to follow all of those kinds of instructions. You can also give it instructions about how it should process. So a very commonly given, if you have a challenging task which you want it to solve in a multi-step process, you can instruct the model to think step by step or to solve it in multiple steps. And other useful things which you could ask it to do, for example, summarize the entire previous interaction that you've had with it up until now, or to generate examples. And these examples might come really using this kind of creative capability. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides at this point and just switch to sharing that interaction with the Claude system. And so you can see here that it's produced this lengthy response to the question, what behavior change techniques are commonly used to support healthy eating? And just see if I can make that a bit bigger so you can read. So you can see this lengthy response, maybe a bit too long. So my next prompt was, could you be more concise? And it takes exactly the response it gave before, but now splits it down into just the bullet points. And then I give it the feedback, that's great. Now could you please generate easy examples? And here you see some simple examples of each technique, which are suggested by the model. Now, of course, this output might not be 100% correct. Such models can make mistakes, and they can give perhaps not the most useful responses. There's a kind of level of expertise that's needed to evaluate the outputs of such responses, but it is obviously very useful and helpful. And you can really do many things with this kind of interaction. For example, you can ask it to, let's try something outlandish. We can say, please write a poem about behavior change for healthy eating, and see if it comes up with something for that. This is happening in real time, as you can see. And here you see it's nicely generated a little poem about small steps to better health, which I leave with you at this point. And I think I can stop the immediate interactive demo part there. And I think, Susan, are we taking questions now or after?
Let's take some questions now. So we have some that were submitted earlier and some that are submitted right now, but carry on submitting them. So some of them are quite general. So I'll start with some general ones, but do ask any specific ones too, we'll take them. So the first one here from Caroline Simpson, where is AI used most in behavioural research, and where do you anticipate its most useful application in future? Janna, do you want to start with that?
So I think I don't know the answer to where it's used most in behavioural research at the moment, but I'm anticipating that it will, one of the #1 usages in the future will be to manage and help people to interact with the enormous body of evidence in much more easy ways than we can do at the moment. I don't know, Robert, if you have something about the current uses to report on.
I haven't seen, you could ask ChatGPT.
Well,
but I think some other uses that are very common for not just behavioral scientists, but others, but including behavioral scientists, are things like summarizing documents, preparing slides from documents, or even just asking it to prepare, bullet points which you can put in your slides. I think that pretty much any sort of task that you're given or that you've got to do that involves generating something, it's not a bad idea to ask one of the language models to have a go. And what you'll often find is that it actually saves you quite a lot of work. You know the answer and you could write it and you could probably do a better job ultimately than the AI model, but it can get you started and save you a lot of work going, at the beginning. But also what I found, and I'm sure many of you have the same experience if you've used AI, is that it will come up with things that you might not have thought of. It's quite good at generating ideas that each of us as human beings off the top of our heads are not that great at remembering to put in. So it can get you going. It won't always necessarily give you what you want, but it'll save you a lot of time. So those kinds of tasks are very, very useful.
I find it very helpful for scoping out topics and structuring topics. So for example, I was asked to go to a conference on psychological science, and on ontologies, and I just put in what use are ontologies for psychological science. Gave an absolutely brilliant, 8 points. So it's structured incredibly well. But as Janna said, you do need to know what it is you're talking about. You do need to be able to distinguish between errors and sort of vagueness and good stuff. Now, we've got lots and lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to ask everybody to be very concise in answering. Oh gosh, there's so many. Can you explain the process of how Gen AI comes up with its responses? My understanding is it works by constantly predicting the most likely word in the sentence based on the millions of sentences it has been trained on. And I think that's correct.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So it predicts the most likely response given your input, but important to know that the training material is not only sentences that it has from the training raw text from the internet, but also a kind of human feedback data set where it's been specifically guided to produce useful responses.
Another one, MS Copilot obtains inconsistent results in qualitative data. How can we assure external validity / reliability? Actually, one of the things that we've been talking with James Thomas from UCL about is using large language models for data annotation, and thinking about using different models to look at inter-rater reliability between the models, and where there are inconsistencies, then bring in the human. So I think the human in the loop is really important here. But Janna or Robert, anything about particularly qualitative data analysis and ensuring validity?
Yeah, I think it's really key that it's part of the nature of the technology. It's by design that it can produce different responses and doesn't always produce the same response. And indeed, you need to either give a more detailed prompt to steer it exactly towards the schema, perhaps, of the qualitative interpretation that you want to have, or you need to, as Susan says, do this multiple times and then find consensus, just as you would for if you had human annotators.
Yeah, and one thing to bear in mind with the general models is that they use what's known as a heat parameter, which is the extent to which they're going to be creative. And, we don't necessarily want them to be creative. We want them to just come up with whatever the evidence is, usually. But they're because they're general models, they're tuned for people asking questions like, or getting them to do things like write a poem, or create some new generative, creative text. So I think that's probably where the more scientifically oriented large language models can be more helpful, because they're not trying to be creative. They're specifically tuned to finding stuff and then summarizing it.
Yeah, and just to kind of reinforce what I said at the beginning, some of them are just based on words, but also some are based on actual studies. So Elicit, ELICIT, and Scite, both are based on studies, and will give you the sort of top ranking studies that meet your question. So there are different types. Esther Flanagan's asking, which of these tools have you found more reliable for the purposes of behavioural science work? I don't know if either of you want to. I mean, I think it changes over time. I think there's sort of, they're racing against each other to get better and better. So my view is I would try more than one for any one task. But I don't know, Janna, Robert, have you got a favourite current one?
So I think among the state-of-the-art, most commonly used models, I would say they are roughly equal in most of our benchmarks related to behavioral science questions. So that's Claude and ChatGPT version 4, and these models. I haven't yet. I mean, DeepSeek is the new kid on the block. I haven't yet got a sense for how well it performs on behavioral question tasks, but I'm expecting that it will be competitive given its performance on other benchmarks.
Yeah, I tried DeepSeek this morning, and I asked it a really very challenging question. I went in later. I'll come to this specifically, but a very challenging question for the large language models, which is, are electronic cigarettes effective in aiding smoking cessation? And the reason it's challenging is because there's some very poor quality data out there, which puts you in one direction, and there's higher quality data which sends you in another direction, and language models can't tell the difference between the two at the moment. And DeepSeek failed abysmally, I have to say, slightly worse even than Claude and ChatGPT. ChatGPT has improved enormously just over the last few months. And I think the way to think of it is like a horse race where, you know, one will push ahead at one point and then another will push ahead and so on. But I think also it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the accuracy that you're looking for will come from your prompt. You need to be thinking very carefully about prompts. And I think creating your own set of prompts that you're finding helpful in particular contexts. And we'll go into that a little bit more later, but the prompt is pretty critical.
Yeah, and very important to be very specific about your prompt. Can you use generative AI to develop a behavior change strategy? And a couple of minutes on that, and then I think we'll need to move on. But we're not losing these questions. We'll come back to them later.
The answer is yes, and that's what I'm going to talk about.
Oh, fine. Do you build up your own data stores which AI can relate to this data, like custom GPTs, AT ChatGPT? Janna?
Yeah, so I think this is really key. We haven't talked about the sort of relationship between the pure model and what it can do, and the way that you give additional information and data kind of on the fly to the model. So those kind of approaches, I think, can massively enhance the accuracy of this type of model while still preserving the wonderful fluidity that it has in composing answers to questions in the various different formats. Some of the tools, such as Elicit or Consensus, which I think Robert will demo in shortly, do use this kind of composite approach where you feed in information that's been retrieved from search results or from a database, and then generate language based on that.
Okay, just finally squeeze in, Jonathan Porter, how reliable is Gen AI in terms of giving source material and references for the ideas, answers it gives? If you'd asked for sources for the answer it gave about behavior change techniques to promote healthy eating, would you trust the references, and how extensive would its answer be? I mean, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that some of them are not designed to be based on evidence and references. They're just scraping words off the internet.
So the pure model, the pure sort of language model, is notoriously bad at references. It's the kind of thing which the language model can't really memorize, because all different references look more or less the same to the language model. So if you want to have good references, you need to have one of the models that's coupled to an external database.
Okay, well, I'm going to hand over to Robert, but when we come back, I think the first one we'll look at is from Kerry Ford. How can we mitigate against bias when using AI to support behavioural research? Very important question. Okay, Robert, over to you.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, so I'm going to look at very specific use case for generative AI, which is in identifying components for novel interventions that you might be wanting to put forward, or interventions that you, as a practitioner, you want to put forward, and on which there has been a fair amount of research. So the use case here specifically that we're dealing with is you've been asked to undertake a scoping review to inform the development of an intervention to address some behavioural issues, such as reducing bullying in local schools, increasing the uptake of stop smoking services nationally, or, for example, reducing the incidence of people exceeding the posted speed limit. It could be anything. The key components here of the task that you're given, or the way you interpret the task, are you've got a behaviour, you've got a direction in which you want the behavior to go, in terms of in some population, you want to increase it or decrease it. You've got either an implied or explicitly stated population, and you've often got a setting, such as schools, for example. And those things are what you need to keep in mind. So you've got your behavior, you've got your population, you've got your setting, and you've got your target. So this is all work in progress, and I'm sure some of you who've been doing this for a while will have your own workflows, but this is a workflow that I've sort of found works quite well for me, that gives you kind of like the best positive features of the different large language model products, whilst militating against some of the negative features. So the way I have been doing it is I want to generate a long list, a sort of a list of potentially effective components, and often for a given mode of delivery. And the reason for that is that very often when you're designing an intervention, you already know what your mode of delivery is. You know, you've decided you want to build an app, or it's a comms campaign, or you've got some kind of service or counseling provision. Not always, you know, if you're a policymaker, you may want to let 1,000 flowers bloom and say, well, I don't know what modes of delivery are going to be relevant here. I just want a strategy that may have many modes of delivery and lots of different things coming into play. But often that's not the case. So the first thing you do is you design your prompt. Then what I do is I put the prompt into one of the general large language model products, such as ChatGPT or Claude. I mainly use Claude, but ChatGPT's improved enormously over recent months. Claude tends to give a more circumspect and considered. It feels more grown up to me than ChatGPT, but I think ChatGPT is now, you know, really doing a very, very good job. So the problem here that you're going to come up with is it's going to come up with some stuff that is evidence-based and some stuff that is wrong. It's just simply wrong. So you don't know. So it's a long list to consider. But then what you can do is you can take the plausible items from that long list. And if you know the area quite well, you'll have an idea about what those are. But even if you don't, you know, just take ones that from your experience look reasonable, or any of them, and then you put them into one of your more focused science-based large language models. And I'm just going to show you Scite, which is the ChatGPT-based one, and Elicit, which is a one that was developed, is one of the earliest ones. And both of these products are, I get emails with new features coming out from these products literally every week. So they're you know, accelerating in terms of their performance. But one of the problems with these is if you go in with your main question early on, they're going to be too specific. They're not going to come up with all the things that might be relevant. Especially Elicit tends to be quite narrow in its focus. So that's why you want to use those things more for the more focused questions. Then it's a good idea to explore different prompt variants with greater or less specificity for the behavior, the population, and the setting. So, for example, you may be interested in schools in the north of England, for example. You can put that in and see if it comes up with anything. It'll always try and find something for you. It very rarely says, at least I've never known it say it doesn't know the answer. But you'll be able to see how far is it sort of deviating from that population. But if that population is there, or that setting is there, then it'll be pretty good at finding it. And this is something that you really get from large language model approach that you don't get from your traditional, one of the things you get that you don't get from your traditional systematic review approach. And that is you can apply the same basic idea to all of the, what we call in the BCW, the appease criteria. Acceptability, practicability, effectiveness is what we usually focus on, but then we've also got affordability, spillover effects, and equity. So you can repeat your questions for all of those criteria and see what it comes up with. You know, how practicable is it to do X, Y, Z? What is the level of acceptability among key stakeholders of X, Y, and Z? And it will give you, it'll find answers if they are there that can help you to answer those questions, which will then help you to get a rounded view about the sort of components you might want to put in your intervention. And then what you would do is you save the responses. It's a really good idea to keep a notebook, as it were, or just store all the responses so you can go back and have a paper trail of what your methodology, which is what you're basically using, has generated, so for maximum transparency. And then you can refine with our human in the loop idea to end up with your scoping review. And with that kind of approach, you can come up with pretty decent scoping reviews literally in an hour or two, in a morning, something that would never have been feasible before. But always be very, very careful with this, that it's still, unproven technology in many areas. And so, put a caveat by what you're coming up with. So I'm just going to go now on to just a quick demo of this. It'll be very, very quick, obviously, given time, but you can have a look at, we can cover some of the things and questions later. So I'm just going to stop sharing and then share the other screen here. So hopefully you can see that. Am I getting a nod? Yeah. Okay. So, this is ChatGPT, the most bog standard, all comers type model and product. And let's ask it this challenging question, which I mentioned earlier, is let's say, how effective are e-cigarettes, cigarettes in aiding smoking cessation? And you can see it's generating, and it often comes up with more than you've asked for. I mean, you can ask it to be, as Janna said, you can ask it to be more concise or to expand on various things. But it will has shown mixed but generally promising results, right? Mixed but generally promising. That's slightly better than DeepSeek came up with, but it's still, it's a well mixed, because it can't tell. Some of the results are positive, some of them negative. Well, okay. And then it talks about the challenges and the limitations and so on. Well, with apologies for those of you who don't believe me, but this is my area of expertise. There is an excellent Cochrane review on this, which shows very clearly that e-cigarettes are effective in smoking cessation, as effective as varenicline and cytosine, which are the two drugs that are most effective. And that when people use them every day in real-world settings, they are effective without the use of behavioral support alongside them. So, there's just literally loads and loads of studies now, but it doesn't know. It can't tell, okay? So that's a bit of an issue. And if I were to ask the same question to Elicit, you'd get a similar kind of thing. But let's ask it something that is more general, like what would be effective behavior change techniques? What would be effective behavior change techniques from the Michie taxonomy? It knows about the Michie taxonomy for reducing bullying in schools. So for people like us, it's quite handy that even the general models know about the stuff that we do. They've been trained on lots of stuff. But so you've got a lot of plausible stuff here: education and awareness, modeling and social norms, goal setting and action planning, et cetera, et cetera. So what you then do in this is you take, well, okay, let's take one of these, skills training, okay. And you go to something like Elicit, and you go, how effective is skills training in achieving a reduction in bullying in school-age children, say, for example. Now, I've got the paid version or a paid version, so I get the top 8 papers. The unpaid version will only summarize the top 3 papers, and it's getting quite expensive, but this is its sort of answer. So it says, to reduce has shown mixed results. Some studies report positive outcomes, etc., etc. Now, again, like with e-cigarettes, when you see something like mixed results, you've got to think, well, it doesn't know, it can't tell at this stage of the development of these things, you know, whether some of these studies are good or not, but it'll point you in the direction of the studies. And in response to a question that was asked a bit earlier about citations, Elicit and Scite and the science-based ones, consensus is another one, will direct you to the references. So you can actually look at the references. Let's try the same question in given to Scite, which is also very good. This is Scite. I also subscribe to this, but you go to the research assistant part of it and ask it a question. And let's see what it comes up with. I'm finding at the moment Scite a little bit better than Elicit at the moment. I'm finding Elicit a bit too narrow. Scite seems to cover more ground. So Scite is a bit more definite on it. It says it's emerged as significant intervention strategy, blah, blah, blah. Sort of demonstrates social skills training can effectively mitigate bullying behavior, for instance, blah, blah, blah. So, and then it goes, in summary, blah, blah, blah. And actually, that's pretty good. You know, I don't know the area, but if you know the area, you know, you might say, okay, I understand, I can, that makes sense to me. And then you can also go to each of the papers and you can get summaries of each of the papers. So I'm not going to go on more, but basically, I haven't covered Claude. You could just put it into Claude as well and see what it does, and then we'll finish. It's, as I say, as Susan has said, it's a good idea to use more than one. And what I would do if you're new to this is I would ask these things, ask it questions that you know the answer to, yeah, that you're familiar with, as a sort of test, so that you can see yourself where it's getting things right and where it isn't getting things right. I'll stop sharing there, but that's basically the broad principle is, and I haven't gone into details of the prompt strategies and so on, but the broad principle is, you know, get your long list using one of the more general models, and then interrogate the more science-based ones, probably using things like Scite, consensus, and Elicit.
Thanks, Robert. That's great. I mean, both of you have given some, for those who are not familiar with using this, I think some feel of how you can use it. And before we go on to the bias question, a few of you have asked about specific uses. And so I'm just going to go through some of these. People have asked about doing thematic analyses of text. It's an excellent use because it's very good at being able to categorize, being able to see themes and bring them together. Somebody else has asked about drafting papers. Again, you know, it is having like a little research assistant sitting on your shoulder. As you're writing it, you know, questions will come to your mind and you'll ask, you know, well, what is the definition of something, or what is known about something? And it really helps to just get you going. Of course, that is not the finished product. I mean, I find it's really helpful for getting you going, first drafts of things, scoping and structuring, and then you with your knowledge, you know, can go in and really elaborate, put in the evidence, give the interpretations, more analysis, etc. Other ways in which I found it really helpful, for example, I've just did quite a long something for putting somebody up for a learned society. I had to do a long thing, you know, document for them. And then they came back and said, well, actually, we want something in 150 or 200 words for a different panel to look at. What did I do? I just took what I'd done before, put it into ChatGPT and said, summarize this in 150 words. Perfect. You know, I read it. Perfect. Took me 3 minutes. If I'd had to do that, it would have taken me an hour or something like that. Then another is saying, how about avoiding self-plagiarism? Self-plagiarism. Really good, good suggestion. And absolutely, you know, if you're, because it can be very annoying when you're told not to plagiarize yourself, you know, put the text in and say, you know, please rewrite this. And you can actually also put in text and ask them to rewrite it with the voice of so-and-so, you know, so you can actually ask for particular types of voices or particular kinds of audiences, etc. Again, you know, rewriting so that it's maximally accessible to lay audiences is another one. Then also asking about literature searches and reviews. I mean, Robbie, you said something about that. Do you want to add anything about, or Janna, about using it for literature searching and reviews? Because very helpful for these objectives.
Well, I think it's very useful for starting the process off in a scoping review, whatever the scoping review is, and formulate your question, have a go at it. I would say that particularly the science-based ones will be quite restricted in the answers that they give. So I would always go to Scholar Google and PubMed afterwards to pick up stuff. So, but what it will do is it will save you an awful lot of time at the beginning, structuring the review and getting the thing going, and you know, and then you can, once you've got a draft with some stuff in it, you can then go to a more conventional literature review process and see if there's any stuff that's been missed. Remember, this isn't a systematic review strategy in the way that we normally think about it. For example, you know, where you might do a meta-analysis or something like that. That's something completely different. This is where you've got some very broad review that you need to do, covering a whole bunch of stuff that in one review. So, you know, if you want to know what is the, you know, average effect size of this intervention or this type of intervention in this population and so on, this isn't the way to find it. I'm afraid that you're still going to have to do, actually, we'll cover this in the second of these webinars using machine learning to do that. But you know, you need analytical AI to do that, because you're getting a number out, you're calculating a number. You're not generating a number, as it were.
And maybe I can just bring in Hannah Family at this point, saying, I'm struggling to see what is the benefit to using AI to generate your list of papers to review over a really well-crafted search strategy of the academic databases, as we currently do in scoping and systematic reviews. Would it be more productive to do the search in the traditional manner, as that produces lists of papers quickly once you give it the relevant prompts, then ask AI to do the screening and summarizing for us, especially if you are limited to a number of top papers on a topic? Now, I think this may be straying into our next seminar. Do you think? I don't know if you want to say something now, but
yeah, I could add one point. So I absolutely agree that this kind of technology is not yet any replacement for a systematic search, also as Robert said, but it could help you, for example, to enhance your search strategy, right? With synonyms and other ways that the thing that you're looking for could be referred to. So you could get a better search strategy by asking for AI assistance at the search strategy stage, and it can produce well-formatted search strategies. And then, of course, it can help with the screening. It can help with the information extraction potentially from the papers. And we may talk more about those particular steps in the future.
But I would also say that with regard to finding relevant research, that when it, you know, we mainly focus on effectiveness when we're doing stuff, but there's all these other things that are so important when you're designing an intervention that you need to pay attention to. That if you do a title search, and you know, you do your classic systematic review, you title search, abstract search, and then full paper search, then you're just going to miss a whole bunch of stuff because it never appeared in the abstract. And until we get to the point that is, was the dream of the Human Behavior Change Project and still is, where you've got full machine readable text at your fingertips, sort of in real time, then to the extent that the language models are scraping full papers as well, which they can in many cases, as well as abstracts and so on, it could pick up stuff that you wouldn't pick up using the traditional method. And one particular example I'm thinking of here in my area is the impact of smoking cessation treatments on cardiovascular disease. And the reason is that cardiovascular outcomes from randomized trials are generally labeled as adverse events. They're not what they were looking for. And so there's this huge swathe of data that's out there in the trial literature that we can't easily get to. And it was really tough to get to and using the usual method. But theoretically, language models, because they're not interested in whether something was an outcome or not, as defined by the study researchers, can potentially pick that up. So it might pick up stuff that you wouldn't otherwise have picked up.
Thanks. So Robert mentioned the Human Behavior Change Project, and Robert, Janna and I were all involved in that project. We will talk about some of its work. It's a collaboration between computer scientists and behavioral scientists, to try and harness AI for behavioral research. But if you want to look at it before our next webinar, the website is humanbehaviorchange.org. Is that right?
.org, yeah.
Humanbehaviorchange.org. Okay, Eduardo Race, you've got your hand raised, but I think the way we're doing this is put the questions in the Q&A. We've got more than Abigail Howard, similarly, if you raised your hand. Lots of people have raised their hands. I think you have to type your questions into the Q&A. We have over 50 questions. Robert and Janna, if you could have a look at the questions and pick out any that you'd like to answer. But could, and one has asked for, actually somebody just come up asking about carbon neutral society and AI. We're going to come on to that in our third seminar, which is going to be on responsible use of AI, which will raise ethics. We'll use that and many other topics, and it will also use bias. But if we could just quickly at this point address the question of how, when we're using AI, generative AI included, do we mitigate against bias?
So should we start with carbon neutrality, because that's the most, so I just would have one quick thing to say about that, which is that I think there's two parallel trends in AI development at the moment. One of them is to increase performance by building bigger and bigger models, and the other one is to increase performance while reducing the size of the model. And obviously the latter is the one we need to favor for the sake of our planet, right? And I do think that there are very exciting results coming with smaller models that are specifically engineered to work in low resource or lower resource settings. And we should watch this space, because ideally this technology doesn't have to be so enormously detrimental to the environment.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why DeepSeek is getting so much attention. And it's very ironic, because the reason they had to go down this road is because of, tariffs and the trade embargoes not allowing China to get their hands on the kind of chips and technology that's needed. So it's gone down this road and found out you can achieve fantastic results with very few resources. So good for the planet. And good for the global south and global equity, which is so important. But we will come back to this in more detail in the third webinar. And on mitigating bias, I think it would be good to touch on this now, because this will help people as they're using these tools going forward. So your thoughts on that would be excellent.
So I think it's well known by now that these models do have a lot of biases built into them by virtue of biased training data kind of going in. And at the moment, without fully retraining and developing unbiased models, which is not realistic given, again, the resource cost that it takes, we have to mitigate the bias in the models with deliberate prompting strategies and external sources of information. So you have to kind of know what potential biases the model might have and develop a prompting and data augmentation strategy to mitigate those biases. And that's part of responsible use of this technology at the moment.
I think one of the things you can do, and you can try this yourself, one of the big biases that the general models have is optimism bias. Basically, they tend to, well, they always give you an answer even if they don't know the answer, but also they'll be very enthusiastic about things, or they'll typically be enthusiastic about things. And so if you sense that it's being a bit enthusiastic, you can say, now give me a less enthusiastic answer. And when I tried that, it then went the other way. It gave a very sort of skeptical answer. I said, well, now give me an answer that's somewhere between the two. And we finally got to a point which looked about right. But I think just bear in mind that the models will tend to be quite positive about things if you ask them things. I think the other thing to bear in mind about bias is that there's nothing particularly generative AI about this. The AI is not introducing any bias; it's reflecting the biases that exist in the input training data, and there's massive, massive bias in the literature out there that we. It's a bit like people complain about social media and fake news. Well, hang on a minute. If you ever look at the front page of some of the daily tabloids, so it's not a new thing, and it's not a thing that ever goes away. And so whatever methodology you're using, you always have to be very vigilant about bias and use all the techniques that we know about and have developed to try to detect and militate against bias.
And I think this is such an important issue, and it's an issue for all of science. Who's asking the research questions to begin with? Who's designing how we collect the data? Who is supplying that data? How's the data being analysed? How's it being interpreted? All the way along, you have biases that are reflecting, in general, the more rich and powerful in society. But, as Robert and Janna said, we have to build in mitigations and think really carefully about how we do that in all our research. But if whoever is asking the question has got any particular issues about behavioural research, do put it in the chat. There are questions about I would say loosely say this as, how do we talk about the use of this methodology when we go to ethics committees and when we publish, for example, with journals? Would either of you like to comment on these sort of issues?
Right. Well, different journals are beginning to come up with formulations, and they're not the same for all the journals. So first thing you to do is just to have a look at what the journal you're thinking of publishing in says. But I think to be in a position ultimately to reliably and transparently report the use of generative AI, I think make sure you keep a transcript of the conversation that you've had with it so that you can refer back to it. And the stages in the process, that's just good science practice. It's like a lab book. But also just be transparent about what you've used it for and where it's sat in your workflow, I think is probably the key thing. Like we would say, we'll use SPSS version 21 for our stats analysis, or R version X. So it's really just about being transparent, I think.
I completely agree about that. And I would add just two small sort of provisos. One is that for some behavioral research where you have participant data or sort of secure information which you have not agreed to share more widely, it may not be possible ethically to put that kind of information into these web-based tools which have their servers in the US or on the other side of the world, because your ethical approval for that private data may not cover that kind of distribution. I mean, it's, of course, the servers are claiming to be secure, but it is still sending the data to some corporate company, which you may not be able to do. So in those cases, if you still want to use generative AI, you need to get access to a secure local installation of the generative AI capabilities, which is possible with various of the models. And yeah, one other point that I always say to my students when they ask how can they describe their use of generative AI in, for example, writing theses and so on, is that some of the ways we use this technology would be invisible unless we explicitly declare it, right? If it's not part of our research methodology, it's just part of the writing that we use it to sort of reformulate our paragraphs and so on. This has to be declared in a different way to an explicit research methodology, because we haven't had to sort of formulate writing support explicitly before, but now we have to. I think it's a kind of new declaration and transparency form relative to what we had before, because it just wasn't possible to get that kind of support automatically before.
A bit going back to the bias, Joanna McLaughlin's asked, can AI effectively help us identify intervention strategies which address health inequalities and inclusion? Can it help to accurately quantify the health inequalities impact? Now, on the first, definitely yes. You just put that question in. And I think you'll be surprised. I think you'll get really quite a range of good ideas on it. When it comes to accurately quantifying the health inequalities impact, that's different. And that's what we'll go on to next time when we look more at analytical AI, which is actually using data as in terms of numbers. If Robert or Janna, if you didn't want to say anything more about that, do you want to look at the list of questions and choose one each while I just say something about Peter O'Reilly's? Because I think quite a lot of people ask this. What is the panel's views on university students' use of AI in producing their assignments and how to manage this, risks, opportunities, etc.? Was a question at that person's institution. I joined a webinar at UCL, my institution, on this topic. And one thing that I learned from that was interesting was that, people are concerned that, people will kind of cheat and will get credit for using this when they don't really know the subject. But what the data have shown, or anyway, the data that this group had looked at, was that the opposite happens. When people use generative AI, what happens is the more able students do differentially better because they know how to use it than those who are less able. And so it's increasing inequalities of ability in a way. So the opposite is true than often what is feared. And how our institution, I think, is basically addressing it is, this is a technology. It's a technology. So many other technologies have come along that we need to understand how to use them. When I was a child, I was taught how to use a calculator to do division and subtraction, etc. And that the important thing is to let people know what you can use these technologies for, how you use them, and then they write their methodology like anybody else, in terms of how they've used it, what it's contributed, etc. And also, I think one of the things that none of the generative AI know about is real world knowledge. And so questions can be brought in that actually are very hard to do through generative AI, because you do have to draw on real world knowledge. Janna and Robert, unless you've got anything particular to add to that, do you want to take one each of the other questions?
So I see we have these top voted questions, and the first one that's highly voted is, how can we use AI to improve the effectiveness of the way that we bridge the gap between research and implementation? And I think this is really a kind of very interesting, because there are many different ways that AI could help to bridge this gap. One way is just accelerating the pace at which new research becomes evident to various stakeholders through this capability that the AI has to process the research results more quickly and to summarize those research results. But another way which I want to highlight is this capability of translating perhaps very technical or difficult to parse sort of research language into language which anybody can understand. And this helps to bridge gaps between, you know, researchers who are knee-deep in a particular topic and maybe other stakeholders who are not quite as deep into that topic, just as a capability. So
I think, yeah, definitely that. And I think, but one thing you can try is, let's say you've got to develop, or some sort of messaging campaign or communications campaign. You can say, I've got these behavior change techniques I want to implement. Can you come up with some messaging? And you can say, 10 words or less. You can set the parameters for it, which would achieve these objectives using these behavior change techniques, and see what it comes up with. What I found when you do that, or when I've done it, depending on the context, is that it comes up with stuff that's like, it's not great. It's not, it's not the sort of stuff that a really good creative would come up with. But it gives you some ideas about things that, oh, well, yeah, okay, I can tweak that, or that gives me an idea for something I could say that would be a bit better. So I think that it's definitely worth doing to see what it comes up with. But what I expect you'll find is that it's just sort of putting ideas into the mix and giving you something to work with, that then you, if you're a good creative or a good message designer, would be able to do a better job using it. But it's a bit, so far, the stuff it comes up with itself is quite vanilla and a bit sort of obvious. But that may change, as time goes on as well.
There's a couple of questions that have been asked about, sometimes they're called synthetic participants. So has AI been used to act as participants in an experiment to test behavioural intervention? What direction could this take? There was a symposium at the European Health Psychology Society conference last year just on this, or including quite a bit of work on this. It's not a field I know about. I feel slightly uneasy about it, but it's a big field, and I'm certainly not expert. Janna, Robert, do you?
I mean, I'm also not an expert. I have seen studies emerging that are starting to do this, and I've also seen studies which examine the kind of distribution of responses that a synthetic participant gives based on a language model as compared to the real participant responses. And if I remember correctly, our synthetic participant responses are less diverse, at least for the moment. And this could, again, depend on the nuances of the prompting strategy or the contextual information that's given in the design of this synthetic participation. But for now, I think no study should assume that they could get truly representative results out of this technology yet.
And I sort of have mixed feelings about it, because I can't quite see the logic. I'm probably missing something, but that, if you're genuinely wanting to find out about human beings, then creating participants based on a language model which is kind of like, it's the computer's understanding of human beings, means that you're basically just studying a computer's understanding of human beings to the extent that it has an understanding. So that makes me slightly worried. But on the other hand, if you're using synthetic participants as a predictive tool, you're saying, right, given our deep learning model that underpins the large language model, or whatever the model is that we're using, if I put, if I ask it to do this, what will it do? And then that becomes a hypothesis. The extent to which real people do that, you can test that hypothesis against real subjects. But I can't see how you would want to use it as the criterion against which you would test a theory or model.
I think, this is your feeling. I think we should
There's my
come
thought.
back, your thought and your feeling. But I think we should come back to this in our third seminar and actually do some research on it, because it's, the argument is, especially for resource-poor countries and institutions, it does enable the generation of data to look at questions that couldn't otherwise be looked at. So I think we not to be dismissed. None of us are experts here. We'll come back to it in the third seminar.
And if anyone is an expert, and
wants to come join us on the third seminar,
I've got it wrong,
let us
then
know.
let us know.
Yeah, no, do any of us Google, and you can find our emails and contact us. Or if there's enough interest, especially in relation to behavioural research, we'd be very happy to host a seminar just on this. So there may be some of you on the call who either know people or yourselves are experts in this area. But these webinars are very much to a resource for the behavioural research community in the UK. So please do come with your ideas as to what you'd like. Now, keep looking, Robert and Janna. We purposefully gave a lot of discussion time on this webinar because we wanted to centre the discussion around the things you were interested in, rather than talk for too long. So I want to take the question from Sarah Griffiths, which is a very concrete question. How can AI be applied to analyse health records, e.g. GP appointment notes, to identify discussions related to specific health behaviours or conditions that are amenable to behaviour change techniques? Specifically, I'm interested in the potential for AI to screen medical records for mentions of preconception healthcare in the context of epilepsy. Now, there's quite a lot in that paragraph, and I think the first thing is to break it down into very specific questions. So, your last sentence said you are interested in mentions of preconception healthcare in the context of epilepsy. That's what you should ask, and do ask it in different ways, because these have got certain words, but you may want to ask the same question in different ways, and it may pick up different data from the records. It's a kind of internal validity check, but also if you begin to see how the responses are different when you ask in different ways, then it gives you a bit of an idea of what's going on. Or identifying discussions related to specific health behaviours, then you just put in what those health behaviours are, and it will find it. When you say that are amenable to behaviour change techniques, in a way, anything is amenable to enabling behaviour change. Maybe you're thinking is likely to be modifiable. That's the first question, isn't it? Which of these is likely to be modifiable? And then the next question, which would need an evidence-based AI, would be, what is the evidence for interventions that would address this particular topic? And again, that one is we're looking at the next webinar. Janna.
I just would supplement that with the comment that if you've got a data set such as electronic health records, again, you're in the situation where you can't really paste them into the public web-based version. You can't paste the actual, you can't put the actual data into, usually because of privacy considerations. So again, this would be a scenario which would be very well suited to running a local sort of private version of a language model. And then you can, you can develop the prompts and so on in a public instance. But once you're actually looking at the real data, it's probably best to have a local version.
One thing to people might want to have a look at is there's quite a few AI-assisted annotation tools out there now, and so you can, if you look at like something like, or even, actually, the one I'm going to say I think probably would fall foul of Janna's ethical thing, which is Notebook LM. Where you can ask it questions specifically of documents. So you put in, you could put in a set of records or one record at a time and ask it to extract information from it. But if you had one, if you use one of these annotation programs, I think it will store the data locally. So it just have a look, Google, automated annotation. There's a few of them now. Well, there's quite a few of them now, and they might be quite good at doing that task for you.
Okay. Robert, Janna, look and see if there's another question you'd like. I've got one here from an anonymous attendee. As you say, there's still a need to have enough skill knowledge to evaluate outputs. But how does this threaten behavioural scientists' role if, quote, lay people can simply ask Gen A for this behavioural science information? So there's a couple of levels at which one can have a think about this. I mean, I think as behavioural scientists, as behavioural researchers, we're wanting as much as possible to empower other people to be able to understand behaviour and be able to access behavioural evidence. And, often people think that, giving one's science, giving one's research away is somehow, making oneself redundant or less important or less needed or whatever. But I think personally, I don't think that's a good way of thinking about it. I think we want to democratize science. We want to share knowledge. And there's so much work to do, so much we don't know that we can be really leading on. And the more we can increase the understanding and the knowledge and the engagement of the general population in understanding behavior, in understanding behavioral research, in understanding the science of behavior and using it for their own goals, the better. So I'd like to see it as a partnership. And we have, as researchers, a lot to learn from everybody else. And this is definitely the ethos of Behavioural Research UK. Janna, Robert, anything on that or any other questions that have caught your eye?
I would just add a proviso that it's wonderful, as you say, Susan, and I agree, if we manage to unlock and democratize expertise for a wider audience through this technology. But there is still a responsibility for the experts to kind of validate the technology for their area of expertise and to identify areas where the technology is really not performing well enough and shouldn't be used because of problems. And this is, I think, a key kind of role in this new, as we go into this new partnership world, a key role for experts to keep safeguarding and checking the technology in the areas of their expertise.
Sarah J. McQuaid has apologies, come in late. How can I find out more about the local tools that Janna mentioned to enable the use of identifiable informational records? What I suggest we do is use generative AI to convert the slides that we shared and the transcript of this session to produce a blog that we can put on the BR UK website, that can then have the resources. And when I say we will produce a blog doing that, it is actually a very good way of starting something off. So we can start off in that way, but we will refine it to whatever words. Janna, is there anything else I mean, the slides will go up on the website anyway, but is there anything else? Maybe we can add some things to the slides before they're put up on the website.
Yeah, I was just going to say I didn't specifically present a kind of technical workflow for getting a local language model running, but there are tools which support this. For example, LM Studio is one kind of user interface based tool which allows or enables people to download and run local instances of language models. And of course, it depends what hardware or technical environment you have, what this actually looks like. But I think it can be quite lightweight. So I just leave that one tool name out there for who wants to do some exploration already, but we can supplement the blog that Susan mentioned with something more concrete.
Roberts.
What?
Wrong answer. Have you seen any question that you would particularly like to address?
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of really good questions. One of them was about affordability, and it does worry me because it's getting quite expensive now to use these scientific language models. Elicit, I think it's about £18 a month, and I think I pay about £14 a month for Scite. I mean, that's not, it's Netflix subscription sort of territory, but it mounts up, and not everyone can afford it. And if you multiply that over, individuals in a lab, it can really start to mount up. So I think we're going to have to do something about that. I'm not sure what the answer is, because obviously this is now a big money spinner for for a lot of these companies, and I know the people at Elicit, and they're really nice, really good people, but obviously they've got they're in a horse race. They have to develop their product at sort of breakneck speed to keep up, and that costs money. So I don't know what the answer is. I hope that something like DeepSeek technology might help with that, and that as we go forward, we can get really powerful models. Also, there's things like Llama as a language model that's completely open source, isn't it? So there are open source versions of these things, that and I'm sure one of the nice things about the internet, the sort of science internet and computer science community, they love giving stuff away because it's cool, and they like building stuff and then sharing it with people. So I'm quite optimistic that there'll be computer scientists out there and software engineers who'll give stuff away.
Yeah. On that, so there were a couple of questions about the open source of DeepSeek, and what's our view of that in terms of data protection, intellectual properties protection, etc. It's interesting having heard the media talking about DeepSeek and saying, oh, yeah, but they've used other people's stuff to do this. It's not all their own stuff. It's not starting from scratch. I mean, the basic of science is that it's cumulative, that we all start where everybody else is, and build on it. And, the Google Scholar strapline is standing on the shoulders of giants. That's what we're all doing, and as it should be. And open source, which BR UK is absolutely committed to, is, for two reasons. One is to make this much, much more efficient and effective and quick, speedy, because we have massive problems facing the world that we need to deal with and build the understanding and the science to do that. And also it's more equitable in terms of all the inequities in the world to be open science. So I think the starting point is open source is good, and I take my hat off to DeepSeek for being completely open source. Anything else on that, or anything else? We've got just a few
I
minutes.
would just add that I think that the sort of close coupling between open science and open source in this area is really key. And I think we need to see and will see initiatives emerging out of the academic landscape that are funded by public funders to kind of unlock these capabilities in a more systematic way for general audience without the paywall, basically.
Yeah. Good. Well, I think we got through quite a lot of material. Robert, if you could share the last 2 slides on your slide set, I can.
I don't have them on my slide set.
we had the 2 closing slides, so I'll try and remember what the 2 closing slides are. So we have feedback. So please do. We'll take you very, very little time to give us feedback, but the more feedback we get, the more helpful it will be for us to give webinars that will be of interest and of use to you. Also do follow up with any topics you'd like us to go into. And in the chat, I saw a couple of you had mentioned people who are involved in using AI for synthetic participants, which I think would be a fascinating topic to pursue. So, do follow up with that. Anybody who's not already signed up on the website to our newsletter, do. Both the recordings and the actual PowerPoint presentations are also put up on the website. And I didn't consult with my co-presenters about doing a blog, but if we can harness some AI and some help from BR UK, we'll do that at some point. And going back to what I said at the beginning, this is the first of 3. We were only going to do 1, and then just realised it's such a massive topic that we would need really at least 3 just to cover the introduction. So the next time we'll be looking at analytical AI, that is very much using existing data for predictive and categorization and other purposes, incredibly important in behavioural research and in the applications of behavioural science. And then, very importantly, the last one on responsible use of AI, and we've touched on that. But, as technologies get more and more effective, so the ethical questions around their use, in whose interest, what kind of regulation, and what's our role as researchers in this whole world. So I think it's really important that we do reflect on that, as well as just going headlong and using these technologies because they're helpful to us. So fantastic to see so many people joining the session. Almost 60, no, I think we had 80 or so questions. And we did, I think, get through quite a few of them, but these discussions will run and run. And we hope to have many other interactions like this in the future. So keep in touch, and I do hope that was helpful and of interest to you. Thank you very much. Bye.